For years, Muhammad Ali faced opponents in the ring, but his most persistent foe was behind the camera. He was more than a boxer. He was a symbol, a voice that echoed against injustice, a man who refused to bow to power even when the price was his own freedom. Muhammad Ali, the self-proclaimed greatest of all time, knew the world was watching him. Every punch, every word, every provocation were scrutinized by millions. But there was a gaze even sharper, more merciless than that of the judges or the public, the gaze of the press. The cameras followed him like stalking predators, waiting for a slip-up, a misinterpreted phrase, a gesture that could be turned into a headline. Ali loved the stage, but hated being distorted. At a time when being black, Muslim, and defiant was an affront to the establishment, he turned every press conference into an arena. Sometimes he smiled and charmed with his charisma. At others he unleashed words that cut like knives. "You write what you want," he would say, "but I am the one who speaks what the people feel." The audience applauded, but the journalists were divided between fascination and fury. This relationship of love and conflict became a parallel battle to the one in the ring. The media built him up as a hero and tried to destroy him as a villain. He responded with poetry, irony, and courage, a man who didn't fear microphones, but knew they could kill him slowly, with words. In this story, you'll discover the human side behind the flashbulbs, the Ali who smiled for the cameras, even when he wanted to break them. The spotlights illuminated Muhammad Ali's sweaty face. It was 1964, just minutes after winning the world heavyweight title by defeating Sonny Liston. The crowd was still roaring outside, but inside the press room, the atmosphere was different. Microphones were stacked, reporters were rushing, flashbulbs were popping like tiny explosions. A young Ali, just 22 years old, stood on the table and shouted, "I'm the greatest. I'm the most beautiful. I'm the king of the world." The phrase made headlines the next day, but what no one knew was that that moment marked the beginning of a silent war, a war between the man and those who narrated him. Ali didn't fear confrontation, not even verbally. From an early age, he understood that, for a black man from the southern United States, speaking loudly was an act of resistance. He didn't answer questions like a common athlete. He turned interviews into spectacles. He danced with his sentences, provoked, rhymed, mocked. "If you dream of beating me, you better wake up and apologize." The journalists laughed, took notes, but some left uncomfortable. The problem wasn't humor, it was power. A proud, intelligent black man speaking as an equal with white reporters in the 1960s was an affront. At first, the love was mutual. The press saw Ali as a media phenomenon, charismatic, handsome, funny, and unpredictable. The cameras loved him, but little by little, that light began to burn. The more he spoke, the more journalists searched for a loophole, a contradiction, something to trip him up. When he announced his conversion to Islam and changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali, the headlines stopped being celebratory and became judgmental. Traitor, fanatic, arrogant, the words were invisible bullets, and he knew it. "They call me Cassius because they can't stand to see a black man choosing his own name." There was a growing tension at each press conference. There he sat before reporters with the same look he gave his opponents in the ring, confident, yet alert. He learned to fight the questions, dodging traps, returning blows with irony. "You want to catch me contradicting myself, but it's you who needs to explain what you do, not me." The silence that followed his answers was as powerful as a well-aimed punch. The audience applauded him, but the press was beginning to divide. Half saw him as a provocative genius, the other half saw him as a threat. Meanwhile, Ali thrived on the chaos. Every criticism was fuel. He understood something few athletes did. The real ring wasn't made of ropes and canvas. It was made of words. The press could create myths and destroy them. That's why he decided to control the narrative. He said what he wanted, when he wanted, without filter. Sometimes he exaggerated, other times he lied, but he always made it clear he was in control. It was his show, his story, his voice. And this infuriated those who believed the power to tell stories came only from those who wrote. However, behind the smile lay a weight. Being the center of attention took its toll. Every word spoken was distorted, every gesture amplified. At home, away from the cameras, Ali would vent to his friends. "They want me to be both the hero and the villain, but you can't please someone who wants to see you fall, even tired." He didn't back down. He knew his voice was the weapon that made him immortal. And while the world applauded him, his relationship with the press began to transform into something more dangerous than any opponent in the ring. Respect turned to resentment, admiration turned to vigilance. There he realized that the same media that had crowned him the greatest was now sharpening its feathers to bring him down. But the champion wasn't the type to shy away from a fight even if his opponent used microphones instead of gloves. By the end of that decade, the glitter and weight of fame were already merging. Ollie would look into the cameras and see not just journalists, but invisible judges, ready to decide what the world should think of him. And before leaving yet another press conference, he uttered the phrase that would seal the beginning of his greatest battle outside the ring: "You write what you want. But remember, without me, you wouldn't have a story to tell." And that's how the world's greatest boxer discovered that the sound of flashes could hurt more than a punch. It was the height of his fame. Muhammad Ali wasn't just a champion, he was a living symbol of pride, courage, and defiance. Crowds followed him in the streets. Children imitated his style. Poets cited him as inspiration. But behind the scenes, the atmosphere between him and the press had become a cold war. The glare of the cameras hid the tension of questions set like traps. Every press conference became a minefield, and every headline a sentence. The turning point came when Ollie refused to fight in the Vietnam War. "No Viet Cong ever called me a nigger," he said in an interview that echoed around the world. The phrase was simple, but its impact was devastating. The press, which had previously treated him as a star, now painted him as an enemy of the country. Headlines screamed harsh words: coward, deserter, national, disgrace. The same man who had once been exalted as the pride of America was now crucified for exercising his right to think differently. Ali faced the court and lost his world title. He was banned from boxing, prevented from fighting for nearly 4 years, the most precious years of any athlete's career. But the greatest pain came not from the gloves, but from the words: "You call me a traitor, but the real traitor is the one who kills innocents in the name of war." The interviews became confessional and trench-like. Many journalists interrupted him, mocked him, and doubted his faith. Still, Ollie remained calm. "I am a man of peace, and you fear those who speak of peace." Television programs showed him being pressured, tested, provoked, and he responded with the same charisma that had made him immortal, but now with hidden pain in his eyes. When a reporter accused him of using religion as a shield, Ollie took a deep breath and said, "If I believed God wants me to kill, then I wouldn't be God, I'd be the devil in disguise. You don't understand because you've never had to choose between fear and truth." The silence that followed was more eloquent than any headline. While the newspapers destroyed him, the people made him a legend. On the streets, graffiti bearing his name appeared like cries of resistance. Young people saw him as the face of a new generation, free, defiant, conscious. But Ollie knew the price of courage. Every interview was a battle, and every wrong word could cost him another piece of his reputation. "They condemn me for speaking out, but if I remained silent, they would call me a coward. So I'd rather die saying what I believe." Cameras followed him, even at home. When he went out to buy bread, there were reporters across the street. When he trained in secret, someone would appear with a recorder. It was like living surrounded by shadows. He no longer knew who admired him and who was just watching, waiting for him to fall. And yet, he kept talking, he kept provoking, he kept being himself. Because silence would be the defeat no punch could inflict. During a press conference in 1968, a reporter tried to humiliate him on national television. "Ollie, don't you think you're being hypocritical? Preaching peace, but living off the violence of boxing." He laughed and responded with the calm of someone who understands the game. "What I do in the ring is art, discipline, respect. What you do with your words, that, yes, is violence." The audience applauded. The reporter lowered his head, and Ollie left the room feeling like he'd won another fight without needing gloves. But deep down, he knew the press would never forgive him for winning outside the ring. They wanted the submissive hero, the silent champion, the smiling black man grateful for the opportunity. What they got was a free, conscious, and dangerous man. Someone who used fame not as a mirror, but as a weapon. And it is at this point in history that Muhammad Ali transforms from athlete to legend, from boxer to voice. The man who once enchanted the newspapers now faced them with the same boldness with which he faced his opponents. Only this time, the ring was the entire world and the audience, divided between those who loved him and those who wanted to see him fall. Before leaving another interview, a reporter challenged him. "Ali, do you think people still respect you?" He stopped, looked directly into the camera, and replied, "Respect. People understand me. Those who don't understand are those who are afraid to listen." If you also believe that courage is telling the truth, even when the world tries to silence you, like this video, subscribe to the channel and comment. The voice is not silenced. Because Ollie's story isn't just about fighting, It's about resistance. And to help us continue uncovering these real stories and improving the quality of our content, consider purchasing our ebook. You'll find a direct link in the first link in the description. Your support makes all the difference. When Muhammad Ali was finally allowed to return to boxing, the world was no longer the same, and neither was he. The Supreme Court's averted prison sentence had freed him physically, but the weight of the war with the press remained. Journalists waited for him like vultures, ready to see if the man was still the same champion or merely a shadow of the myth they had destroyed. He returned changed, more mature, more skeptical, but with the same sharp tongue. "You took my title, but you couldn't take my soul," he said before dozens of reporters, his gaze firm and his face illuminated by the cameras. The return was more than a sporting rematch. It was a political spectacle. Every pre-fight interview was a battlefield fought in words. Ali answered not just for himself, but for millions of silenced voices. "I'm not just fighting men, I'm fighting ideas." The press, however, didn't forget. Some journalists still treated him like an enemy, insisting on provocative questions. "Do you still believe you deserve America's respect after what you did?" Ali sighed, smiled wryly, and calmly returned the blow. "Respect isn't given, it's earned. And I earned mine by taking hits and getting up more times than you can count." The public, divided, watched this invisible duel between the man and the media. There were reporters who silently admired him, recognizing his greatness, but were forbidden from openly praising him by spiteful editors. Others pursued him with hatred disguised as professionalism. Once, during a live interview, a journalist accused him of being too political for an athlete. Ali leaned forward and said, "Do you think my skin color allows me to be just an athlete? When you're born black in America, politics is the air you breathe." The audience gave a standing ovation. The camera captured the reporter's angry look, and that image traveled around the world. Behind the scenes, Ali confided to friends that he was tired, but not defeated. "They want me silenced, but my voice has traveled too far to be stopped." The headlines were beginning to change. The same man once called a traitor was now seen as an icon of courage. Time, slow and relentless, began to turn in his favor. The world saw the emergence of a new generation that saw him not as a villain, but as a modern-day prophet, someone who challenged the empire with words and paid the price. Still, he knew the press would never forget. "They will call me a hero when I can no longer answer back," he said in a rare moment of melancholy. During the fights that marked his comeback, especially against Joe Frazier, Ali wasn't just facing opponents. He was fighting to regain the respect that words had taken from him. The rivalry between the two was inflamed by the media, which distorted statements and created headlines that fueled hatred. Ali calls Frazier a traitor. Frazier vows to silence the clown. What was sport became a media war. Deep down, both were victims of the same system that fed on conflict to sell stories. "They want blood," Ali told a friend. "And it doesn't matter whose blood it is, as long as it stains the newspaper." Even injured, even with his body battered by fights and years on the sidelines, he never lost control of the narrative. At a press conference after a loss, a reporter asked him if he still considered himself the greatest. Ali laughed, wiped the sweat with a towel, and replied, "The greatest isn't the one who always wins. It's the one who gets up when the whole world expects him to stay down." The silence that followed was so heavy that not even the flashbulbs dared break it. The love-hate relationship with the press had turned into a kind of bitter symbiosis. They needed him, and he needed them. Without the journalists, his voice wouldn't resonate. Without him, there would be no story. But Ali played with this duality like few others could. When he wanted to, he charmed. When he needed to, he attacked. He knew that the microphone could be as powerful as the fist. Words are like punches. Use them carefully, or they'll come back to bite you. And it was thus, amidst applause and conflicting headlines, that Muhammad Ali began to understand the true meaning of fame. It is a gilded prison. Within it, every gesture is observed, every silence interpreted, every word recorded. He no longer fought just for victories in the ring, but for his own truth, a truth that many tried to write for him before leaving a press conference after the Frazier fight. A reporter teased him, "Ali, do you think you've made peace with the press yet?" He stopped, looked around, and replied with a slight smile, "I don't know if the press can make peace with the truth." And as he left the room, with the sound of cameras flashing behind him, it became clear to everyone, the man who once fought with gloves now won with words. Only, in this new ring, every victory came with a price, the price of being misunderstood. Muhammad Ali's last fight didn't take place in a ring. It took place within him, against his weakening body, against his mind trying to escape time, and against a past that insisted on being remembered by others. While the world transformed him into a living statue, Ali fought an intimate battle to remain human amidst idolatry. The press, which had once attacked him as an enemy, now followed him with a mixture of regret and reverence. But the champion, ever conscious, seemed to see beyond the lenses. He knew that the flashbulbs that now exalted him were the same ones that had once burned him in public. In one of his final interviews, his speech slow and his eyes teary, he said something that remained etched in the souls of those who listened. "You write stories about me, but the real story is what each person feels when they see me." It was there that the legend revealed the secret of his greatness. Muhammad Ali never fought for fame. He fought for meaning, to show that strength lies not in fists, but in purpose. He became the mirror of an entire generation that learned to fight not just with muscles, but with ideas, with faith, with the right to be heard. In his final years, he began to avoid cameras. He preferred simple moments gazing at the horizon, playing with his grandchildren, praying in silence. Still, every now and then, he would appear in public, and the whole world would stop. Headlines hailed him as an eternal legend, an immortal icon, a symbol of peace. But behind each headline lay a silent truth. Ali had won over the press not with anger, but with time, because while they reduced him to headlines, he became a message. His funeral in 2016 was broadcast to millions of people around the world, and there, amid tears and applause, something symbolic happened. Journalists of all backgrounds, including those who had once criticized him, lowered their cameras and wept. It was as if finally the entire world had understood who he was. Not just the fighter who defied giants, but the man who defied narrative, the one who made words his sword and silence his shield. During the ceremony, one of his longtime friends took the stand and said, "Ali taught us that the truth can be more painful than a punch, but also more liberating. He never fought to be loved. He fought to be understood." That sentence echoed like a final round. It was the perfect closing to the story of a man who spent his entire life balancing love and conflict with the world, with others, and with himself. And so, the relationship between Muhammad Ali and the press found its conclusion, not in reconciliation, but in redemption, because, in the end, they needed him more than he needed them. It was his words, his provocations, and even his silences that gave the media its greatest stories. And, ironically, it was the press itself that immortalized him, transforming him into what he always claimed to be, the greatest of all time. Today, when we talk about Ali, we don't just talk about boxing. We talk about courage, faith, and conviction. We talk about a man who understood that the microphone could be as dangerous as a closed fist, and yet held it fearlessly. A man who looked at the world and declared, "I am the greatest," not out of arrogance, but out of conscience, because he knew that being great wasn't about beating everyone, but about enduring hatred and remaining true. The legacy he left was not only of victories, but of humanity. He showed that even the strongest bleed, even the most confident doubt, and even the loudest learn to win through silence. Muhammad Ali was not only the people's champion, he was the champion of truth. The truth that no newspaper could shape, that no reporter could reduce, that no headline could erase. And if today the sound of his voice no longer echoes through microphones, the world still hears what he meant in every sentence, in every look, in every silence. Because, as he himself once stated, with the eternal brilliance of one who understands his own destiny, I fought to be heard, but I won when I learned to be remembered. And that is how Muhammad Ali, even after the last bell, remains undefeated, not in statistics, but in the memory of the world.